Hello and welcome to today's program, Towards a US-Korea Tech Alliance. My name is Jonathan Corrado, and I'm Policy Director here at the Korea Society. Thank you so much for everybody who's joining us from all over the world. Today's program is part of our running series on technological cooperation between the United States and South Korea. Last year, the Korea Society presented its Van Fleet Award to LG and General Motors in recognition of their partnership on batteries for electronic vehicles. We also did a program this past September with Korea Society President and CEO Tom Byrne discussing the global chip supply chain with Tammy Overby, former president of the US-Korea Business Council, John Neufer, president and CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association, and Wong Kyung Kim, executive vice president of Samsung Electronics, Inc. Over the past few years, supply shocks for products like phones, washing machines, and cars have forced us all to become experts on semiconductors and other tech supply chains. The US and South Korea have agreed to cooperate on chip supply chain resiliency, manufacturing, mutual investment, and development. This high-level coordination speaks to the fact that semiconductors really live at this intersection of economics and national security. An effective alliance approach is going to require future-oriented thinking and a balance between resilience and innovation. I think today's speakers have the capability to discuss these issues with nuance and insight. It is my pleasure to introduce them. First, Dr. Miyeon Oh is Director and Senior Fellow of the Asia Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. In fall 2021, she was appointed Director and Senior Faculty Lead of Korea Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, where she received her PhD. Dr. Oh has public sector experience with the United Nations and Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Her areas of expertise include global supply chains of emerging technology critical to national security, US-China strategic competition, and the US-ROC alliance. Miyeon, thank you so much for joining us today. And perfect expertise for what we're going to talk about. Troy Stangarone, next up, is Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute, where he oversees trade and economic initiatives. Mr. Stangarone has written extensively and has been widely quoted on US-Korea relations, South Korean trade and foreign policy, and North Korea. He previously worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Robert Torricelli on issues related to foreign affairs and trade, and the Hill plays an important component in today's discussion as well. He holds an MSc in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a BA in Political Science and Economics from the University of Memphis. Troy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We are taking your questions live. Thank you so much, audience members, for tuning in. We already received a bunch of those, and we're going to keep on getting them, and we'll feed them into the conversation as we get them. You could email to policy@koreasociety.org. Okay, Troy, now turning to you, can you talk a little bit about what attracted you to this issue in the first place? And then in terms of our first substantive question, I'm going to borrow one from June Park at Princeton University, who asked, how do we even define a technology alliance?
Well, Jonathan, it's great to be here with you and me on today to talk about this. And June, thank you for the question. I appreciate that. This is something that's always kind of excited me. I've always, growing up, been very interested in technology and the intersection between foreign relations, security policy, and economics. So this is sort of like a natural, I think, fit for me. We think about how tech has just changed our lives in the last 15 or so years. With Facebook, Twitter, a lot of these platforms may seem like they've been with us forever, but they're relatively new, and they've significantly changed how we take and view technology, how we view information, how we receive and consume information. And I don't know that anyone, when they originally came out, would have seen the profound impact they've had. So to me, how these issues kind of overlap in terms of economics, politics, and foreign relations are quite interesting. So to June's specific question, though, on like what is a tech alliance, if we look back, in recent years, you've seen proposals for a T12 or a T10, some of them coming from the United States. Places like CNAS had put forward the T12 idea. I believe the United Kingdom put forward the T10 idea originally. But largely, the idea was to try and develop groupings of what are called often techno-democracies to try and cooperate on coordination of policy related to regulations, export controls, and other types of issues. Ultimately, I think for me, at the end of the day, what this really comes down to is how do we deepen our cooperation on tech issues that are important to both of us in terms of supply chains, in terms of regulations, in terms of dealing with new technologies that do have the potential to be disruptive going forward, so that one, they benefit both countries economically, but two, we make sure that they don't take and undermine our national security. So it's really about the cooperation aspect on a wide range of issues that have both national security and economic implications.
Thank you so much, Troy. And that's a really good point. And, just speaking to the multilateral aspect, of course, there's the more you multilateralize tech cooperation, the more meaningful it ultimately becomes on things like subsidy ceilings and export controls. However, the more you multilateralize, also, the harder it is to come to an agreement to do those kinds of things. So I hope we get a chance to unpack some of those discussion points later. So let's turn to Miyeon now. Miyeon, what drove you to this issue set? And why have discussions of a tech alliance gotten so much more attention lately?
Thank you, Jonathan. And first of all, having me today, and also very delighted to join the panel with Troy. So I mean, just for some reason, this tech cooperation has fascinated me. And we Atlantic Council, we published a US ROC joint effort report on the fourth industrial revolution in 2017, where that time everyone, just was talking about North Korea. So I'm personally very glad to see that this is one of the top priority agenda nowadays. But it is really because of, driven by the pandemic and enduring U.S.-China tensions, but then a lot of things that are related to that, including the really accelerated speed of the digitalized global economy, etc. But I'd like to offer a brief overview from the US viewpoint and ROK viewpoint, why this economic security is getting so important. Because I learned that we have a diverse group of audience today. And so as you all know, the Biden administration hasn't released its national security strategy document yet, but we can see from its interim document, which outlines a framework for the US to build back better, both abroad and home. And I think it's important to just take up and back on to think about that. So at home, the United States should continue to fight against and recover from the pandemic. We were talking about this during the Green Room, and really, it impacts, just every sector, all the life. But in addition to that, mitigate climate change and invest in the US infrastructure, clean energy, and emerging technologies. And they're trying, US is trying to recommit to the foundation ideas of democratic values and diversity. And abroad, the US should is trying to redefine its role as a global leader by working closely with its allies and partners to meet complex challenges, mostly led by the authoritarian regime, which is China. So for the United States, enhancing self-efficiency in technology and innovation is key to US-China strategic competition. Therefore, the Biden administration is committed to increasing investment in the industries that are critical to national security in order to promote domestic manufacturing and secure US supply chains of critical technology. So the Biden administration has collectively identified which sector, which specific industries and product have gaps, and how the US can target industry investment in ways that complement both the United States and its allies and partners. And another key important question for the United States is how to deal with China in the areas that the US and allies depend substantially, while retaining like-minded liberal democracies' key competitive edge. So in doing so, the administration is seeking to advance a common agenda among leading democracies, as Troy said, and shape foreign and economic or trade agenda through existing or new framework for multilateral cooperation, such as G7, the Quad, Summit for Democracy, and also the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And as you know, the idea of the framework was first announced by President Biden during the East Asia Summit in October last year. And Secretary Raimondo and USTR Catherine Tai visited Asia in November and mentioned that US government is going to announce a specific plan in early this year, 2022. While we don't have much specific about the framework, but it has indicated that it includes several topics such as trade facilitation, in digital trade, supply chains, in clean energy infrastructure and worker standard. And just pointing out quickly that South Korea also released National High-Tech Strategy Industry Special Act, 국가 첨단 전략 산업특별법, that was signed on January 25 and will be enacted after 6 months. So I just wanted to say that technology is one of the key policy agenda for also presidential campaigns in South Korea, which will happen in March this year. And for instance, candidate Yoon of the opposition party said that he will establish US Rock Tech Alliance focusing on semiconductors, batteries, artificial intelligence, biotech, 6G, nuclear reactors, air and space. So these are, I mean, really, just effort from, each country, but then I think it's really easy to see why this is getting so much traction.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That explains a lot of the political context here, explaining the motivations from both the American side and the Korean side. And I think that really sets up Troy nicely to talk about right now, sort of big picture. How are we doing right now in terms of US-Korea technological cooperation on things like semiconductors and batteries and any other technologies, if you want to go there? What are the strengths and the weaknesses of the current effort as you see it?
Yeah. So at the Moon Biden summit last year, the United States and South Korea agreed to make essentially mutually complementary investments in both semiconductors and electric vehicle batteries. This has been two of the key areas that we've been working together on. But also at the same time to work together to address supply chain issues for both of these industries. We've seen some progress since the summit, and some of this we'll get into sort of Miyeon's comments on like climate change and energy cooperation as well. But Samsung has announced they're going to build a second semiconductor facility in Taylor, Texas. Less noticed, I think, though, at the summit was DuPont announced that it would invest in a new R&D facility in South Korea for semiconductor chemicals. This is actually the second investment that DuPont has made in South Korea in this area since, in essence, relations between Korea and Japan deteriorated and started to take place into question Korea's access to certain key chemicals from Japan. So you're seeing cooperation in terms of building final construction in the United States, trying to shore up the supply chain a little bit in South Korea on the US side. There's also new announcements on EV battery facilities in the United States. Most recent being the Ford Blue Oval City EV production facility outside of Memphis, Tennessee. And then the 3 SK battery plants will be set up in Tennessee and Kentucky to take and provide the batteries for those production facilities. In fact, actually, the EV battery sector, 11 of the 13 high-capacity battery facilities being built in the United States by 2025 are going to be built by South Korean manufacturers. The United States' ability to actually transition to electric vehicles will largely be dependent on Korean battery manufacturers. So in essence, we have an alliance in this area, if you will. There is real complementary and reasons for this. This is why I think you're seeing this happen. While China's CATL is known as the world's largest EV battery producer, most of its sales are actually in China, where a combination of both regulations and strategic tax breaks have largely kept Korean producers out of the Chinese market, despite the fact that they actually had production facilities already in China. China was working to build up its own national champions, and South Korea and Japan, who is another significant player in this field, we're seeing has potential threats to its own development in this area. So the United States market and the EU are important markets for Korean manufacturers, and Korea is focused on both of those markets. All of this is beneficial to both countries in the manufacturing sector, but as you note, there's some challenges. The United States and South Korea have commercial interests that will not always align with the government security interests. The two governments, when we talk about China, are going to need to balance the commercial reality that their firms need to be in the Chinese market, either one, to sell to Chinese customers, or to supply parts to, even in some cases, their own or US companies. For example, Apple, most of its production is still in China. They take and supply or get batteries from both SK Hynix and Samsung, depending on the model. Those chips are going to be needed, not batteries, sorry, excuse me, semiconductors are going to need to be shipped into China or produced there. So you have these sort of tensions between the commercial and the national security side. They're going to have to be worked through.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if we look at, for example, the EV battery market, China dominates both the mining and the refining of many of the minerals needed to produce these batteries. It's going to take time and commitment for both governments to try and develop alternative sources to lessen that dependence. And it's unclear that both governments are actually going to be committed to doing that or willing to work with third-party governments in
Right.
doing this.
Right.
This is something that, to Japan's credit, they've tried to do with Australia. And so I think, this is the challenge, is that commercial interests and national security interests are going to conflict at times. And to be honest, you're going to have tensions between each country's national interests as well.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. And a lot to unpack there. I might want to ask what is the stronger motivation, the political side or the economic side? Because as you mentioned, this makes a lot of good business sense for both sides to be getting into economic relations here in terms of the DuPont factory over there in Korea and Samsung's multiple factories here in the US. What is the stronger source of incentive, do you think?
I think we're actually seeing the two merge, is how I might put it. With, as Miyeon mentioned, China's own rise, its development. China is now a significant competitor in certain tech areas. So if we look at, like, say, facial recognition, Chinese companies are actually probably the top companies in the world in this area. China is working to develop its own semiconductor industry. It's still generations behind the US and South Korean industries, but there are competitors here. If we didn't have the national security imperatives from the resumption of great power competition, we've seen, tensions between China and the United States over numerous issues grow in recent years. Maybe a lot of this could be left sort of on the commercial side. But because now that the United States and China are in competition with each other directly, how much that coordination is going on with Russia and perhaps other countries, taking and perhaps raising some of that tension, raises other questions. But I think when you look at this from the US perspective, if we're going to be engaged in a long-term competition with China, we need to have the technological and industrial base to be able to do that. This is essentially what helped us through the Cold War. And if you look back through history, technology and economics play an important role in great power competition. If you look to the United Kingdom, for example, how the Industrial Revolution completely changed its place in the world. It went from a peripheral country to one of the dominant countries in the world. And so there is a strong economic incentive, especially because the Chinese market is not as open as other markets in much of the world. But at the same time, if you look at this from a geostrategic perspective, it's important for the United States and Korea and its other allies to work together to, one, ensure that they're not basically pushed out of markets. We've seen this happen with China and other product areas, to where they try to let companies in, acquire technology, build up essentially national champions, and then you see those companies sort of pushed out of the Chinese market. So if we don't work together, you could end up seeing many of our technological industrial bases continue to be hollowed out, and then you'll be left in a less appealing strategic position relative to China on national security as well as economics. So I think they're kind of coming together.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And the American alliance network is certainly an asymmetric advantage over what China is attempting to do, partnering with countries like Korea, where we have common values and similar political systems, commitments to democracy, et cetera. Okay, so Miyeon, I want to turn to you. Any additional thoughts or anything that Troy said that sparked your mind? And then I'm going to ask you about public-private sector cooperation.
Sure, thank you. So I just wanted to just add one more angle, that the reason why I think that this is probably private sector see this right now, see more incentive, right? So Atlantic Council, we have ongoing effort on supply chain. So advanced technology or high-tech technology is not all about supply chain, but then it has a lot to do with supply chain. That's why we hear just so much about supply chain. But then the truth is the supply chain disruption or security issue is just not, this is not a new thing, new phenomena. It existed before, but then I think, from the project, I actually engage with, I directly communicate with a lot of stakeholders, including private companies from multiple countries. And I hear a lot that before the way, it was much more costly to build a planned manufacturing lines in the United States. But then right now, because of the geopolitical situation, we have this Ukraine crisis, this what happened in Afghanistan, and pandemic and everything. I mean, they feel that we're living in a very different world and time, and then really like just period of uncertainty. So I think a lot of business leaders and executive managers, they just think that this is less costly to build their production lines in a more politically stable countries, and especially building on the alliance. So I think that is an important big factor, and then really has changed their decision-making process.
Right.
And I just wanted to point out one area that US ROC could be thinking in terms of the joint effort, which didn't get much attention so far. So as I pointed, the high-tech strategy industry special act that was released in South Korea. So some of the expert and formal official, they're writing a lot of like op-ed in the Korean major media on what's good and what should be better. And I think one area that probably is lacking a comprehensive plan in that new act is probably R&D and human resources. And also we hear so much about the talent, the human capital, how is it critical, not just to ROK, but for the United States. So I think this is where maybe the two countries can think about the joint investment in advanced semiconductor R&D and also advanced workforce development. And we can even think about public-private partnership in advanced workforce development. And for instance, students can get training from private companies directly, but then with the government subsidies. But then we can only think about we can also think about that not just from the government subsidy, but then it could be jointly funded by the private sector. And then we can just talk about not only the universities in the South Korea, but then major universities, Midwest, just for example, like Purdue could be one example who has a major in semiconductor. So maybe South Korean companies could do some training program as part of the educational training, and also the two countries can think about their joint effort in the third countries. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention that quickly, and maybe just switching. I think it might be also good to talk about this. I think there are still big questions for the topics that we're talking about right now. So number one, this is a point that I wanted to follow up on Trey's point. So how should we define a trusted, value-driven digital and technological system? Because since we're talking about multilateral cooperation and what is a desirable framework, but then without a right definition or without defining what is it about, it would be hard to think about the next stage, which requires close coordination and cooperation. And the next question would be, what would be a desirable allied and multilateral approach, like I said, to enhancing resilience of the global supply chain system and to building a trusted, value-driven ecosystem. And I think most importantly, what role government should play and to what extent can government require firms to operate more in line with national security interests.
Absolutely. Great points there. And so now I want to transition to another aspect of the work that you've done at the Atlantic Council and some of the programs that I've had the opportunity to attend. This was a discussion point. And that's the cooperation between the private sector and the public sector on these technological initiatives. This is a really complex issue because, as we've been talking about, it's economic, but it's also national security. Perhaps as one example, we could talk about the fall 2021 White House meeting where the U.S. requested supply chain information from top chip firms, including South Korean firms, but also including others. And the purpose of this was to help identify potential sources of bottlenecks that could happen in the future. And it looks like the Commerce Department just released that report. So can we talk about how that meeting demonstrates sort of the complexity between the public and private sector cooperation?
Thank you. I think that is a very important and tough question. And so, we all know that the main purpose of RFI is transparency, but then also the Commerce report, I think, still poses an important but challenging question. So how can firms manage short-term and long-term risk to balance national security requirement and commercial interests and economic competitiveness, right? So, I mean, as I said briefly, we're talking about new environment where the US government is directly communicating with the private sector and they're directly requesting for information, for transparency, not just to American companies, but also to foreign companies, right? So I mentioned that we have ongoing efforts and we have group of people from all the semiconductor, I mean, not all, but the most of the semiconductor companies. And so not just semiconductor, but then from engaging with multiple tech companies, this is what I heard, and I thought that was very interesting statement. So some people mentioned that they would like to know how the US government is going to continue this practice, because they all think that this is not going to be one-time thing, and then it'll be a multiple requests. That's what they think. And they are worried about the situation where, what if they receive the same or similar request from the Chinese government? I thought that they would be very provocative and unusual and probably very hypothetical situation. But I think it's fair to say that there should be a clear roadmap or guideline about what US is trying to establish long-term partnership, which was clearly mentioned in the document, the long-term partnership through transparency. And another complexity is to explain how US domestic effort align with its effort to work with allies and partners in the international level. So is it mostly job creation domestically, or is it really like supply chain resilience, and how are they different, right? And also, how does like Building Back Better or Buy America fit together with its diplomatic effort, such as the Quad, as we know, the Quad has a working group on critical and emerging technologies, for example. And just Jonathan, you and I talk about this before this event started. So the work and the Commerce report explicitly mentions that it is important for the Congress to approve the $42 billion on domestic semiconductor production included in the USICA, U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. So, and then also one more point, the report also mentions that the private sector is best positioned to address near-term challenges. And so the government should ensure long-term strategy to enhance the transparency and long-term partnership. So again, I think, I don't think I have a clear answer for now, because it's a still like evolving concept, and then continuous effort that requiring close coordination with all the related stakeholders. But then what sort of long-term partnership are we talking about? I think it's unanswered. It should be answered. And designing policy for emerging and future technology is a very comprehensive process, reflecting different priorities of each country and also even each different industry sector.
Thanks. There's so much to unpack there. And it seems, evident to me that a technology alliance will require the same sorts of credibility signaling and trust building that a security-based alliance requires. And this is something where you build up trust over time. There's a demonstrated common values in place, there's a demonstrated common commercial goals, but then to really make the national security aspect of it really work is going to require that trust building process over time. Is there anything that the US can do to really credibly communicate that this is really about shared interests and that the national security elements are not going to overshadow the importance of innovation and the commercial interests?
Thank you. And you mentioned that you are hoping for us to talk more about the multilateral framework and techno democracies or techno alliance, right? Technology alliance, tech alliance. So I don't think there is any simple just recipe, and I think it is important to keep continuing the U.S. line of effort, which is really industry specific or sector specific. And even when it comes to U.S. strategy toward China, it says that it has 3 buckets, right? cooperative, and then and competitive and adversarial, right? So I think even approaching for the emerging technologies, I think we can have different targeted approach. And that's why we hear more about the targeted decoupling rather than complete decoupling, which is like almost unlikely and unrealistic.
Right.
So I think that any multilateral cooperative framework should be adaptable and open to structural adjustments. And I hope that US-ROC could be the first meaningful bilateral link and into incorporating into the multilateral framework. And I think that's really the only, that's probably the one of the desirable way moving forward. And so for example, semiconductor, it's very complex and requires a lot of, technological know-how and etc. So and semiconductor, many people say that the approach should be very different from overall strategy of the supply chain resilience because of the specific circumstances characteristics. So again, I think sector specific, issue specific would be desirable, I think.
Awesome. Great response. Thank you, Miyeon. Troy, let's turn to you. Any additional thoughts on innovation versus resilience? And then Miyeon mentioned USKorea, and the CHIPS fund is part of that. And it would create, if passed, hopefully it's passed, the creation of a State Department Tech Partnership Office. And that would establish a common funding mechanism for development and adoption of measurably secure semiconductors and supply chains. So can you talk about how this might play out, why it might be important?
Yeah, so I think first I'll kind of start with your question to sort of build on some of Mia's comments on how do you build trust and really kind of develop this out. And I think part of it is the question of how can the United States help its allies? And I want to say allies rather than even though we're talking about South Korea today, just South Korea. And if we retake the request for information that was put out, there was a lot of discussion, about some of the issues in it that were seen as perhaps proprietary information. Who are your top customers? How much business do you do with them? And things that companies perhaps understandably didn't want to share. So, part of that obviously is making sure that that information is not leaked or given to competitors, because I know there was some concern that U.S. competitors might get their foreign competition's information. So, I think part of it is that, but I think part of it is, as I said, is how do you actually then help your allies? One of the questions in that RFI was, where are you facing supply chain shortages? Now, if the United States, after getting that information, can help, be it TSMC, be it Samsung or whomever, if there's a specific area that they had a challenge in sourcing, inputs, then I think that's one way you can build trust, by showing that this process and a lot of what the United States is pushing for right now, yes, it's partially about trying to revive industry in the United States, but that it's not a one-way street. And I think that there needs to be that component to it, because without that, I think ultimately companies and even our allies are going to push back, because it'll be like, all right, we've tried to help you out. Where does this, really benefit us? And so I think that's a key component. I think on the innovation versus resilience part, there's really kind of two sides to this, because they're on the one hand very different. If we look over the last 2 years, there's been a lot of discussion about whether there needs to be more reshoring or nearshoring of supply chains and how we go about doing this. But I think the reality of the situation is that if you look at supply chains right now, what we've seen happen is that there were initial disruptions as countries shut things down. We didn't necessarily know how COVID-19 was going to progress, but relatively quickly you saw manufacturing, exporting get back up and running. There have been periodic periods to where we've still seen disruptions, but those are not primarily from the pandemic, at least not directly. They're from increased demand for consumer durable goods, because people right now aren't going to movies. They're going out to restaurants on a limited basis. They have a lot of extra money to spend, so they're spending them on new computers, new gaming systems, new vehicles, new durable goods that often require semiconductors. There's been a shortage of semiconductors, but not because there's less being made due to the pandemic, but because there's so much more demand for them now than the past. So on the one hand, we've seen decent or very good resilience on the private sector side. And I think we should be aware of that.
Yeah.
The innovation side is when you do go through prolonged periods of stress like this, because increased demand is a stress. And I mean, you cannot take and build a semiconductor factory, in 6 months. These things take time. They take large capital investments.
Yeah, that's an important point. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do we deal with this long term? Part of this is about, companies rebalancing how much, stock they have, in their storage in terms of, more semiconductors backed up. Some of this is going to be about how do we take and use technology to better equip factories to either shift production to certain specific items that perhaps are becoming more scarce at the same time. How do we deal with the issue, the auto industry is faced in that, they buy a lot of low value chips. They need a decent amount, but they're only 8% of the semiconductor market. So if you look at this from TSMC, Samsung, anybody's perspective, they're not the high value customers. So how do we
Right.
deal with low value customers, but not totally take and undermine their industry by saying, well, Apple is a more important purchaser, so therefore we're going to sell everything to Apple. How do
Yeah,
we
right.
balance these risks?
Right.
At the same time, innovation is much different. This is the R&D side of the component. Miyeon talked about, can we collaborate on R&D? How do we find structures to collaborate on R&D that don't undermine the competitive side of things? So, to where, perhaps Samsung is reluctant to cooperate with Intel because they see Intel as a competitor. So how do you balance innovation in terms of the corporate competitive side of things? I think that's the real challenge going forward on the innovation side.
Yeah.
And to your question on the, tech office, in essence, what the CHIPS Act called for was for within state an interagency office to be established. So you'd have people from commerce and other departments with specific technical expertise who would be on tap by this office. It would be headed up by someone at the ambassador level. They would be responsible, in essence, for coordinating our tech policy outreach with our allies and partners, specifically partnerships with countries who share common aspects of rule of law, freedom of speech, and human rights, and also are interested in the safe development of technologies. Now, one of the goals would be to take and work together to establish rules and norms for these new technologies. And some of the areas where at least the legislation envisions this office focusing include things such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, wireless technologies like 5G, surveillance technologies, and of course, semiconductors. And so I think the broader idea is to try and have a focal point within the US government who can reach out to our partners on these specific issues and perhaps others, because, artificial intelligence, if we think about autonomous vehicles, which is in essence an AI capability, how do we take and manage the source coding, what can be shared, where the liability ends up being at, what AI functions will be allowed in different countries. So even when you set aside the national security side of things, there are sort of complex issues that we need to go through and really work with our partners and allies on these issues going forward.
Thanks so much, Troy. And yeah, just on the difficulty of predicting the demand in lots of different critical technology sectors, but in semiconductors in particular, hugely capital intensive, takes 2 to 3 years to build the fab. And then you have to look out 2 to 3 years. What's the demand going to be like then? So who in 2017 was predicting a global pandemic to cause a spike in demand, right? No one was predicting that. No one could foresee that. And then very quickly, the design becomes outmoded and outpaced by competitors. And you got to start all over again. So really, really cutthroat industry, semiconductors.
Yeah, and I think, this is a broader challenge too. And I don't want to say there's not a role for government in this, because I think there is. I think in terms of helping to coordinate, try to bring, partners and companies together. But if we go back and let's just for the sake of argument say that the supply chain review by the US government was done before the pandemic rather than after it had begun. One of the things that would not be on that list of key items would be lipid nanoparticles. And a lot of people may be saying, well, why do we care about lipid nanoparticles? These are a key component to the mRNA vaccines that Pfizer, Moderna, and others are using and that have been found to be the most effective vaccines. Those same technologies also have potential for dealing with cancer and other type of diseases, but there's a very limited supply and a limited production supply chain for those specific particles. It's a key component of something that matters a lot right now, but I don't think anybody would have looked
Right.
into, how do we take and secure that? And so not only do you have these like timeline issues, but clearly semiconductors, I think, are something that we all know are going to be important for a long period of time. But there's going to be, I think, lots of issues that we're not even thinking about right now, similar to if we had been doing this before the pandemic, like lipid nanoparticles, that are going to be very key going forward that we're going to need to be thinking about as well.
Right, right. Okay, so now Miyeon, turning back to you, you have a lot of pragmatic policy suggestions for supply chain cooperation. You recommended a semiconductor working group within the newly created US-ROC Supply Chain Task Force. Looking forward, what else should be on the roadmap there? And this sort of echoes a question that we got from Mark Mannion at the Congressional Research Service. He asked, what are the existing agreements to facilitate tech cooperation between the US and Korea, and what new arrangements are needed? So that kind of coincides with my what else needs to be on the roadmap question. Over to you.
Thank you. So if you don't mind, I wanted to go over what my suggestion was about, just for
Absolutely.
the audience. So I suggested that the US-ROC could cooperate on the establishment of the sector-specific working group to directly engage with the private sector and industry expert, which is really critical, like Trey just mentioned. And there are ongoing efforts, as you pointed out, and there was a semiconductor dialogue in December, and this is really ongoing efforts involving relevant stakeholders, and they're going to just continue this effort. And so what I think is, so how we can operationalize the May leaders joint statement by the two governments, and we can probably consider those bilateral interagency task force, something like a steering committee that is government-led. And this working group can serve as a consultative body with the leading US and South Korean firms, as well as industry associations. And in order to develop measures that increase the security and resilience of existing supply chain, for instance, working groups can collaborate on monitoring supply chain intelligence on both existing and emerging non-market risk that can threaten to disrupt critical supply chain, which is what we are seeing right now, right? And that this government body and could be one of the like a former role, like they actually facilitate this dialogue, right? And I also suggest, and this is actually additional point of what you talk about and asked me before, and how the two countries, US-ROC, can expand bilateral supply chain cooperation into multilateral effort through flexible and informal framework. So, and since we're talking about semiconductor, I think the US and ROC could consider working with the major players, major players of private companies. You talk about, TSMC. So also, we companies from Japan, Netherlands, United Kingdom, and even Germany, right? To identify shared geopolitical risk in the supply chains. And also they can monitor engaging on a government policy, including tariff, export controls and government procurement, or any other measures that could impede efforts to strengthen the supply chains. And so I think this is really, it could also facilitate, when necessary, the implementation of export control measures and coordinate with relevant government regarding the semiconductor product. I think this could be, should be part of the any discussions on following up the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, because this is one of the important component. So that's what I'd like to say here. You're muted.
Sorry, that is a great point, and I think a great suggestion, and in acknowledgement of the fact that there is this tricky component of coordinating between the public and the private sector. We need conversations first, conversations to inform what is the most effective strategy. One other aspect that I wanted to bring up is, so someone watching this might ask, why does it matter so much, semiconductor cooperation between the US, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Netherlands? Why is it so important? I think it's just worth mentioning this. You guys, of course, know this, but this is for the benefit of some of the audience members who perhaps might not. The nature of the semiconductor global supply chain is that it's highly distributed, but it's also highly specialized. So certain countries have sort of, their specialization on things like the US does logic chips really well, Korea does memory chips really well, and they have a really high percentage of that particular market covered in their own domestic manufacturing. All these different countries have different sort of niches. The Netherlands is really good at making this machine which produces the high-end chips. So it's all so global, and that's why it's important to work together to make sure that we can address supply chain issues and also the national security and increasing strategic cooperation, competition with China. Okay, so I want to turn now to the multilateral aspect here. And we got a question from Andrew Yo, SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies at the Brookings Institution. And he asked a question that I was going to ask to Troy, but I think he does it even better than me. So I'll just ask it the way that Dr. Yo has it here. How has the US and South Korea navigated potential friction with other US partners, such as Japan or Taiwan, if they potentially compete for market share in a given sector? For instance, how might Taiwan or Japan react to growing US-ROC partnership in semiconductors, EV batteries, if they sense that the US is favoring Korean companies? To what extent do tech alliances create competition among US allies? And to what extent is there something for everyone? So this is kind of like the way I ask a question where it's like, okay, a lot. So just any aspect of that question that you feel motivated to tackle. I'll go first to Troy, then over to Miyeon.
Yeah. No, Andrew, I mean, that's a great question. And I think, this sort of hints that, I was talking about before about the tension you're going to have between corporate interests and national interests, and to be honest, sometimes between national interests amongst our allies. I think I would say I agree with Miyeon, on multilateral side of things. And I think I'd actually go a step further and I would say, we really, bilateral cooperation is sort of a baseline. You have bilateral meetings, you talk about issues of common concern. But on a lot of these tech issues, tech is not a bilateral issue. It is not a bilateral commercial issue. It is perhaps minilateral is the best phraseology for some of these things. Yeah. And it's not an East Asian issue. We were talking about semiconductors now, and the UV equipment that the Netherlands produces is necessary for basically everyone. So this is an EU issue, this is a US issue, this is a Korea issue, this is a Japan issue. And you need to sort of work with the key players in this case, semiconductors, but this is true of other technologies as well. If you look at, say, for example, 5G, traditionally the European Union was a big player here with Nokia and Ericsson. At the same time, the US used to have a lot of equipment manufacturers, but we've sort of faded back in that area. Samsung wasn't much of a player, but now in 5G is. If you look at the patent distribution in terms of who's actually developing the technology, everybody likes to talk about Huawei as being the dominant firm, but Samsung and LG have more key patents together than Huawei does. So there's this very complex nature to this, and you need to work across that. Now, that being said, to get to Andrew's question, I think part of the hope is going to be that, especially in things like semiconductors, that there is going to be so much demand going forward as everything becomes wired, that everybody is going to be able to gain from this. Now, that may not end up being the reality, but I think that's sort of the top level hope. But I do think you start getting into this challenge of how you sort of filter all of this apart, because if the United States is just cooperating with Korea, then Japanese firms are going to feel like perhaps they're getting pushed out of the market. I mentioned on EV batteries, Panasonic is one of the key suppliers. They've worked with Tesla for a long time, but Tesla is now developing its own batteries as well. I'm sure that there's going to be interest on the Japanese side in getting into contracts with US firms. And in an ideal world, if we move to electric vehicles more quickly, there will be a need for Panasonic to supply Ford, Chrysler, GM as well. So, once again, that's sort of the hope, but we don't know that it'll end up that way. EV pickup may be slower than expected. That may then push Panasonic out of the US market because you have these established relationships with SK, Samsung, and LG. So I think the way you work with these tensions to try and bring everybody together and have the governments work on high-level issues, things like making sure regulations aren't discriminatory in the countries who work together, making sure you're working on international regulations and norms as well to make sure that the broader international market is open to US and US allied partners' products, depending on what the tech issue is, that you work together on export controls to make sure that sensitive technology isn't being sent to problematic countries. And so the governments work on the high level stuff, and then the companies ultimately work out the commercial side. Who does it make more sense? Is Panasonic ultimately a higher quality, cheaper producer than Korean producers, and so therefore they get more of the battery market? Or are the Korean producers lower cost, better quality producers, and so therefore they start pushing Panasonic out? So I think the policy side needs to be done on the government level, and then the corporate side needs to handle the broader aspects of this. And hopefully that's sort of how you try to deal with some of these tensions. But I think in a specific example, because we are talking about Korea and we have talked about semiconductors, I think the one thing that the pandemic has shown us is that if Japan had followed through on what people had feared when tensions rose back in 2019 with Korea, we'd be in a much worse position than we are today. And that it's important for Japan and South Korea to work together on tech issues and to not allow these issues to be drawn into the broader historical disputes and tensions within the relationship. Yeah. Japan is an important critical supplier of key components for significant South Korean technologies and semiconductors and other areas. And this is a relationship that's important to both countries, and it needs to be maintained. And I think the pandemic has shown us what can happen if that relationship does get disrupted, specifically disrupted very quickly.
Right. And Ambassador Lee Soo-hyuk said last year that Korea is reviewing, cooperating with the Quad's working group on critical and emerging technologies, including chips. So that, of course, the Quad would include Japan. So the importance of that sort of multilateral cooperation as well. One of the sticky issues when it comes to public-private cooperation is subsidy ceilings. And I don't know if there's ever going to be a time where that has to be addressed. But for instance, the US, it was sort of way more expensive to produce here in the United States because of the lack of those subsidies, and that from the federal level. And that's starting to be, that would be addressed by the CHIPS Fund, if and when that passes. But there's also local level types of incentives that can be offered, such as in Texas. But Miyeon, I want to turn over to you for your thoughts about the importance and difficulty of multilateral cooperation on chips and other stuff as well.
Yeah, I can agree more with what Troy just said. I don't think it's a bilateral relationship. It's a global issue. And why we're just talking so much about semiconductor, but we're not really talking about creating or establishing new platform, because they already have a platform like, World Semiconductor Council. But then with the new environment, what kind of platform would work better? I think that's every involved stakeholders are navigating and exploring, I think. And this would be really challenging. I already talk about, it probably would not be able to think about sort of alliance type of, framework. That's why I think that any framework should be really open and also like structurally adjustable. Otherwise, it's gonna be very challenging. And so I actually think that this could be actually opportunity to actually think about multilateral framework. And just going back to TSMC, actually they announced building the plant even before Samsung did, and then SK did, during the Trump administration. So of course, all the companies, they're like competing over market share, but I don't think the decision to build plant in the United States, it's really from the competitive mindset, with this company, etc. So for example, you talk about, Troy talk about the Korea-Japan export control and the trade dispute. But then maybe we can think about prospect of the US ROC-Japan trilateral cooperation. And Troy mentioned briefly about the rare earths. So for example, Japan has long know-how than South Korea, and then this rare earth element was included one of the 4 area that President Biden, selected for his president's executive order, right? And rare earths, and we talk about the heavy rare earths and heavily relying on China. But Japan, since the Fukushima Daiichi, they tried to diversify the source of rare earths and try to build up a relationship with other Southeast Asian countries, and also working with Australian company like Linux. So, maybe this is the area where US ROC and Japan could think in terms about the trilateral aspect, and also even semiconductor. Why not? Because, as you said, US is a leading player in chip design and, SME, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and South Korea is a leading manufacturer, but then Japan, they're basically, SME, production of wafer, but also like assembly, testing, and packaging. So because of the different comparative advantage, I don't think it's not impossible for them to think about trilateral cooperation.
Right. Very good point. Okay, I want to turn to some questions from our audience, and this is largely about what other technologies should we be thinking about. So, Miyeon, I'll turn to you first. This is from Johannes Alefelt, and Johannes asks, what technologies have priority? Anything else other than semiconductors? We've mentioned a lot so far, but any others that you might want to bring up? And Robert Snedden at McClarty Associates and Jae-Bum Kim at Korea America Association both mentioned 5G. So if you have any thoughts on 5G or any other things, pharma, rare earths, over to you, Miyeon.
Thank you. Great question. So I actually read, Troy, your most recent piece with the diplomat, right? So he laid out potential list really well. And I think that hydrogen and also smaller SMRs, small modular reactors could be also a good area of potential cooperation. And of course, artificial intelligence and a lot of green technology related to climate change, mitigating climate change, and biotechnology. I think those are the area that and the two countries can move forward. And actually, at the May joint leader statement, it didn't get much attention, but then South Korea and United States, they agree, actually, they signed the Artemis Accord, the first ever operation in terms of, in the space. So maybe that's the area they could do, more. So I would like to see more progress.
Very cool. Thank you, Miyeon. Troy, over to you. And yeah, congratulations on a great article for the Diplomat, which is quite relevant for today's discussion.
Yeah, thank you both for mentioning it. I think the one thing, because I think Miyeon did a great job of laying out some of the areas, and just I'll sort of elaborate a little bit on my thoughts on hydrogen maybe then. I think this is actually a good area where we can think creatively and try to think mini-laterally, because if hydrogen is going to become a viable energy source from a commercial perspective, it's going to need to have markets developed. You're going to need to eventually reach economies of scale. But also one of the key components to this is that to work on climate change, you need to have green hydrogen. And that means you need to have, in essence, excess renewable power. So more than you would use to take and do other things within your economy because of the energy transition contents within hydrogen in terms of what you get once you convert it to a liquid and other things. And so that means, I think, this is where bringing in Australia, who has strong solar potential and potentially wind potential, and Chile, who's also looking to develop and export, in essence, its solar power as well and move into hydrogen, to be key partners, because Japan is also looking to develop this technology. So cooperation between the United States, Japan, Australia, Chile could be really an interesting thing here that could really maybe help move this technology forward. So I think, that's sort of what I look at when you think of new technologies and how maybe you can take and have new groupings as well that would help move these things forward.
Really interesting suggestion. Troy and Miyeon, you've brought so much to the table here today, and I feel like we could just keep going for another hour. But out of respect for your time and our audiences, we'll call it here. Thank you so much. We really, really appreciate your wonderful insights. And I know that this is going to lead to more conversation, and hopefully we could keep up this type of programming and keep engaging you in the future. Two upcoming events to flag for our audience members is February 15th. We're going to have our second in the Global View series, and we've got Yale University professor Odd Arne Westad to discuss his new book, Empire and Righteous Nations, 600 Years of China-Korea Relations. So you can check out our website if you want to sign up for that. That'll be a live webcast in addition to a limited in-person audience. And then on February 23rd, we've got Korean Smart Power. And that's a conversation about opportunities and obstacles for Korea to leverage its cultural influence to advance its national interests. And for that program, we got Bernie Cho, expert on K-pop, president on DFSB Collective. Jenna Gibson, she's a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago, who does a lot of work on this topic. John Delory, Yonsei University professor, and Victoria Kim, Seoul correspondent from the LA Times. So please check out that. And for other stuff, go to koreasociety.org. Thanks everybody so much for tuning in today. Hope you have a great day.